For years, Wes Hampton kept something close that most people in the gospel music world assumed they already understood. The Gaither Vocal Band has always been a community where discretion and grace travel together, and Wes, measured in his words, warm in his delivery, careful with the kind of honesty that could easily be mistaken for controversy, fits that community completely. Which is exactly why what he said about Michael English landed with the weight it did. The admission came in the kind of setting where Gaither artists tend to be most real, gathered and unhurried, away from the formality of a stage, and what emerged was not a rehearsed tribute dressed up as candor, and not a careful performance of generosity toward a complicated figure. It was honest, in a way that fans of both men had not quite heard before, carrying the texture of something that had been held back for a long time before it was finally let go. What Wes admitted about Michael English, the full weight of it, the part that took years to surface, is the story this video is going to tell. By the time you reach the 10-minute mark, you will understand exactly what he said, why it carried the weight it did, and why it took this long for someone standing this close to the inside of the Gaither world to finally say it plainly. Wes Hampton joined the Gaither Vocal Band in 2005, stepping into one of the most storied groups in Southern gospel history as a baritone, with the kind of warm, controlled voice that locks into a harmony with natural ease. The kind of blend that Bill Gaither has always prized, and that homecoming audiences respond to immediately. Longtime fans of the Gaither homecoming tradition welcomed him with the loyalty this community is known for. A loyalty built not just on music, but on decades of shared Sunday mornings and quiet Saturday evenings, on homecoming videos that played in living rooms in kitchens across America, on albums that traveled from the CD player to the car to the church pew and back again. For millions of people who grew up with those recordings, Wes was not simply a new voice in a familiar setting. Over his years with the group, he became genuinely part of the soundtrack of their faith. And in this world, that distinction carries real weight. Before the Gaither Vocal Band, Wes had already built a quiet reputation in Christian music circles as someone who brought genuine reverence to whatever he sang. Gospel songs, in Wes Hampton's hands, were never product and never performance for its own sake. They were testimonies to carry and deliver with care, and every time he stood on a Gaither stage, that came through unmistakably. Bill Gaither built his ministry on exactly that quality. Not voices with technical skill alone, but voices attached to faith that was actual rather than performed. And Wes Hampton carried that from his very first homecoming appearance forward. And then there was Michael English, and the longer, more complicated story that Wes had been carrying without fully telling anyone. For anyone arriving at this corner of gospel music through this video, Michael English came into the orbit of the Gaither Vocal Band in the 1982 and became, in short order, one of the most celebrated vocalists that Christian music had ever produced. His was a tenor voice of extraordinary range and emotional control, the kind that contemporary Christian music encounters perhaps once in a generation, the kind that makes other serious gospel singers stop mid-breath and recalibrate what they believed was possible. Multiple Dove Awards followed. Recognition across both the Southern gospel and contemporary Christian music worlds came in a way that very few artists ever achieve. And Michael reached it before the age of 30. His recordings, songs like In Christ Alone, The Prodigal Son, and Holding Out Hope to You, became permanent fixtures in Gaither homes across the country. Songs people returned to not out of obligation, but because something in them kept delivering, kept reaching something that easier music could not touch. By the early 1992s, Michael English stood at the peak of everything. And that is exactly where the story begins its first hard turn. The details of 1994 have been part of the public record for decades, but the weight of them still arrives fresh when you consider the altitude Michael was standing at when it came apart. He admitted to an affair, resigned from the Gaither Vocal Band, and then, in one of the more striking gestures in the entire history of gospel music, voluntarily returned 5 Dove Awards as a public act of contrition that no one required of him, and that he chose to make anyway. That gesture told you something about the man even at the worst of his moments. What it told any particular person depended on how close they had stood to the story and how much they had invested in what Michael English's testimony meant to their own faith. Bill Gaither, through all of it, kept the door open. That relationship, the one between Bill and Michael, stretching across the long years after the fall and surviving chapters that would have permanently ended most professional and personal bonds, became its own kind of testimony within the gospel community. Bill has spoken about it publicly more than once, in the plain language of a man who believes in restoration not as a comfortable theological abstraction, but as something you actually do, with all the difficulty and uncertainty that living something out involves. Restoration in the Gaither world has never been a metaphor. It has been, case by case and year by year, a practice. But here's the question that rarely gets asked, and the one that connects most directly to what Wes Hampton eventually said out loud. What does it feel like to step into the Gaither Vocal Band, knowing that one of its most gifted voices had also been one of its most wounded? What does it mean to carry the music forward when the memory of someone like Michael English still sits in the air of every homecoming stage you stand on? Wes arrived in that group 11 years after the fall, and those years had not simplified the story. By 2005, Michael English had been on a road of his own that included not only the aftermath of 1994, but, in the years following, a serious and publicly acknowledged battle with prescription drug dependency that he addressed openly in interviews, naming it specifically rather than managing it from a careful distance. The road back was neither short nor straight, and Michael did not present it as anything other than what it was. That ongoing transparency, the uncomfortable kind, the kind that costs something each time it surfaces, had become inseparable from his ministry, running alongside the recordings rather than hiding behind them. Wes knew this history. Every devoted fan of Southern gospel music knew it. But knowing history and actually carrying it with you every time you walk onto a Gaither stage are not the same experience. And the distance between those two things is where this story actually lives. In candid moments that began surfacing over the years, the kind of setting the homecoming tradition creates naturally, unhurried and informal, cameras still present but the formal pressure lifted, Wes Hampton started letting pieces of something larger show. What he said about Michael English was not the measured, diplomatic acknowledgement of a successor paying respects to a predecessor. It was the admission of genuine, complicated admiration, the kind that does not simplify what it touches and does not need to. Stay with this, because what Wes said specifically, the part he had clearly been holding back for a long time, is the section of this story that gospel media has passed over without stopping to examine. And this is where the story takes a turn that nobody in his circle fully expected. When Wes Hampton finally let this particular honesty land without pulling back from it, what came out was layered in a way that simple tributes never are. He acknowledged, without the careful qualifying language that usually attaches to subjects this sensitive, that Michael English's voice was unlike anything else that Southern gospel had produced. Not nostalgia softened by distance. A fact stated plainly by someone who had spent years thinking about it from close range. The range, the emotional precision, the ability to inhabit a lyric rather than simply deliver it, the way a phrase could land with weight and stay there. These qualities in Michael English were the kind that reshape other singers' understanding of what is possible, that set a standard in the mind of every serious gospel vocalist who followed him. Wes, by his own account, was one of those singers. Michael English's voice had reached him before he ever stood on a Gaither stage, and he carried it into that role and through every year of his ministry since. None of that surprised the longtime fans who already knew both men. What came next was the part that landed differently. Wes talked about what Michael's transparency had come to mean to him over the years. Not the fall in 1994, but what followed it over time. The years of Michael English standing in front of audiences and being genuinely honest about where the road had taken him, naming the addiction specifically, accounting for what it had cost, telling the truth not once as a managed public statement, but continually, over time, as a matter of how he understood his own life and his own ministry. Wes said, in the kind of plain language that stops people mid-conversation rather than filling the room, that this kind of honesty was its own expression of the gospel. Not sung from a stage, but lived out in plain view, with all the difficulty and exposure that living something visible actually involves over the long run. In a Christian music world where the expected narrative arc runs from struggle to resolution and stays there, where artists are often implicitly asked to carry their hardship in the past tense, darkness acknowledged but resolved, testimony sealed and delivered, Wes Hampton was saying something that cut across that expectation entirely. He was saying that the ongoing version of Michael English's story, the version that does not resolve cleanly, the version that is still in motion after all these years, deserved the same respect as the recordings that made Michael famous. That the complicated man and the extraordinary voice were not separable, and that honoring one required sitting honestly with the full weight of the other. Within the extended Gaither family, responses to this kind of openness have always been more layered than they appear from the outside. Bill Gaither has spoken about his continuing relationship with Michael English across many years and in multiple settings, about a belief in restoration that, in that community, is not theoretical. Other members of the Gaither world have offered their own quiet affirmations of Michael's journey across the decades. What made Wes Hampton's version of this conversation carry a different weight was not the sentiment, which is broadly shared in this world, but the specific directness with which he expressed it. He was not performing magnanimity. He was offering genuine admiration and genuine respect. And this audience can always tell the difference between those two things. For fans who remember watching Michael English on those early Homecoming recordings, who can still hear where his voice landed on certain phrases, who held their breath in those moments the way you hold your breath when something genuinely beautiful is happening and you want it to last. What Wes said was not behind-the-scenes information. It was a statement about what gospel music is actually for, and what the people who carry it forward truly believe about the grace they sing about every night. For those of us who have followed Wes Hampton's journey through the years, this kind of candor is not entirely surprising, even if the form of it arrived more unguarded than usual. He has always been an artist who leads with faith rather than with image, and the fact that he held this particular honesty back for as long as he did tells you something about how seriously he took its weight. This was not a casual comment. It came from a place that clearly mattered to him, offered by someone who understood exactly who he was talking about and what that person's story had meant to the community they both called home. What this story carries for the broader world of contemporary Christian music and Southern gospel is worth sitting with for a moment. The Gaither homecoming tradition was built, from its earliest recordings forward, on exactly this kind of honesty, on gathering artists who had seen hard things and still believed, who had not arrived at faith through a clean road, and were not offering a sanitized version of one to the audiences who loved them. Michael English's story belongs to that tradition even in its most difficult chapters. His voice defined what was possible for a generation of gospel vocalists. His fall shook a community that had invested deeply in both his talent and his testimony. And his return, incomplete, ongoing, honest, belongs to the same tradition of faith lived in plain view that has always been at the heart of what the Gaither ministry does. What Wes Hampton did, in giving honest language to an admiration he had held quietly for years, was to honor that tradition in a specific and meaningful way. He was not stirring old pain for the sake of a story, and not settling any kind of score. He was a man of faith talking about another man of faith, with the full complexity that genuine faith and genuine humanity always carry together, trusting his audience to be large enough to hold it. If you have been a fan of Wes Hampton since the early homecoming days, you know exactly what it means when one of these artists finally says out loud the thing they have been carrying quietly, because the chances are good that you have been carrying something similar yourself. That connection between the artists and the community that has followed them for decades, built on shared music and shared belief, is what makes the Gaither world unlike anything else in Christian music. Moments like this one are exactly why. There is one more part of this story that most people have not yet connected, and it sits in a chapter of Michael English's history that gets mentioned but rarely examined at full length. After 1994, the road forward was neither simple nor short, and Michael did not claim otherwise. The years following his departure from the Gaither Vocal Band included ongoing personal struggles, including the later publicly acknowledged battle with prescription drug dependency that he addressed directly in interviews over the years. What Bill Gaither recognized across all of those years, and what Wes Hampton was reflecting in his own measured way, is that this kind of ongoing transparency is not separate from the gospel this community gathers to sing. For this audience, for the men and women who have returned to homecoming recordings through their own years of hardship, grief, doubt, and return, an artist's honest journey carries weight alongside the artistry, and sometimes more. Michael English's relationship with the Gaither family, the one that survived the fractures of the 1990 seconds and continued across the decades that followed, is its own statement about what restoration actually looks like when people practice it rather than only preach it. The homecoming tradition has never been built on perfection. Russ Taff stood before those cameras and eventually told the full truth about years of struggle with alcohol. And that honesty deepened what his ministry meant to the people who heard it, rather than diminishing it. Jake Hess sang through the health battles of his later years with a perseverance that became inseparable from the message of the songs themselves. Michael English, in his own complicated and specific way, belongs in that company. And Wes Hampton's willingness to say so plainly confirmed it in a way that nothing else quite had. What comes next for Wes Hampton and his continuing ministry is something the gospel community will be watching with the kind of attention this sort of artist earns across a long career. He has never been the loudest voice in any room, but across his years with the Gaither Vocal Band, he has been one of the most consistently trustworthy ones. That quality carries its own authority in a world that has always valued sincerity over spectacle. One question this story leaves open is worth sitting with. What does it mean for Christian music when its artists begin to speak honestly about the complicated figures who shaped them, not from the comfortable distance of a formal tribute, but from inside a faith that holds failure and grace at the same time, without rushing to resolve the tension between them? Michael English shaped a generation of gospel vocalists. He shaped what they believed was possible for a voice, for a stage, for a lyric. The full reckoning with that legacy may still be unfolding. Whatever comes next, fans who have followed these ministries for decades know one thing: neither of these stories is finished. The conversation that Wes Hampton opened with his honesty will continue in the places where the gospel community does its most meaningful work, not on stages, but in living rooms, in church pews, in the quiet moments when the music says what nothing else can reach. If this story moved you, the next video will as well, because we have been covering the real histories and relationships behind the Gaither homecoming family, and what has come out of those conversations is just as unexpected as what you heard today.